your host.
I am. I was nominated to be the host, and so we'll see if my nomination holds up after recording a couple of episodes.
That's good. We'll remember to hang on at the end, Ty. We can count.
Oh, that would be super. Yeah, that would be super. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Okay, I think we should start admitting folks and then give them a couple minutes. We'll read through the instructions, and Ty, you and I can just kind of be helping each other with admitting as the other person's talking.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay, so you want to mute, go ahead and mute me, or should
I think you'll be okay. Here we go.
Welcome, folks.
Welcome, everybody.
I think we're going to give another minute or two for folks to join us and settle in before we get started.
So many great faces.
I know, familiar names, familiar faces.
There is also live transcription available for folks if they need it. Welcome, welcome. We also have a few folks in here that I know are joining us for our VIP session. Just
hey.
We'll give folks just a couple more minutes. Welcome, everybody. We're waiting just a couple minutes for folks to join us.
This is one of those rare occasions where I'm excited that we will have multiple pages to leaf through. Sometimes in the Zoom room, it feels kind of sad when you can't see everybody all together, but it's kind of nice tonight.
That's right. That'll be great. Welcome, everybody. We'll take just a couple minutes more for folks to arrive. I know Oisey operates with a weird Oisey time rule.
Yes.
I don't do the 5 minute later thing, but a lot of people do.
We'll embrace it for this one night only.
Oh, yes, that's right. Just today, special.
Just today. Yes. And in fact, as folks are settling in, you're going to see this link come to you a couple of times. But we have some folks in the room who may not have attended a Toronto Writing Project event before, and we're so glad you're here. And if you're keen to, we would love for you to sign up for our newsletter and any notifications about future events. I've just posted a form in the chat. And as I said, I will probably post it again. So apologies that you're going to hear this spiel more than once tonight. But we're really excited to have new faces and new folks joining us for these events.
Yes, for sure. All right. I think we're holding pretty steady. So I might just begin because I know that we want to get our full time with Dr. Elizabeth Dutro. That's who everybody's here to listen and learn with today. And so I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Toronto Writing Project for joining us here today for TWP Speaks for our inaugural sort of speaker series. And so we're thrilled to have Dr. Elizabeth Dutro here together or with us virtually from afar from Colorado to speak with us today. We did want to acknowledge that most of what occurs through the Toronto Writing Project is always provided through the generous support of Ruth and Alexander Dworkin and the Tolerance Fund, which promotes collaborations and professional learning between the Center for Urban Schooling and local leaders within the Toronto area and the wider province of Ontario. So I'm actually going to turn it over. I'm Cassie Brownell, by the way. I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm an assistant professor at Oisey, but I'm going to turn over to a fantastic PhD candidate. Yeah, right?
Yes, I think I get to use that word now.
So that he can do our land acknowledgement and welcome Dr. Dutro. So we're excited to have you all join us.
Thanks, Cassie. Yeah, welcome everybody. As Cassie mentioned, we are in Toronto and not everybody is in Toronto, but I do want to start just by acknowledging that the land that the University of Toronto operates on, that for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And that today this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're super grateful that we have the opportunity to be on this land and to share this space with you. I know that some of you are zooming in from other places across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have you joining us in this virtual space on this land that we're sitting. We're also very fortunate that we have Dr. Elizabeth Dutro with us tonight. Elizabeth Dutro is a professor of literacy studies at University of Colorado Boulder. She lives in Denver with her spouse, and her 2 young adult children also live in the Denver area. Elizabeth's research grew from her encounters with children, curriculum, and educational policy in her experience teaching 2nd and 3rd grade in an elementary school in Southern California, a little warmer than it is here. Her inquiries are driven by questions about the intersections of literacy, identity, life experiences, and children's and youth's opportunities for positive, sustained, and vibrant relationships with school literacies. Through close collaborations with children and teacher colleagues, her current studies include how justice-focused framings of trauma and intentional considerations of difficult life experiences can inform literacy instruction that center students' knowledge and their brilliance. She's also working with teacher colleagues to study innovative ways for teachers to learn together in the context of their daily work and their relationships with children. In her book, which many of you have already had the pleasure of reading, but we're going to get to learn more about tonight, The Vulnerable Heart of Literacy, Centering Trauma as Powerful Pedagogy, was published in 2019. Definitely read it if you haven't yet. And you can also find her work in journals such as Language Arts, the Journal of Literacy Research, and Research in the Teaching of English. And last but not least, Elizabeth is a fan of pop culture and is always eager for conversations about the MCU. I just learned today that the MCU is the Marvel comic universe. Did I get that right, Elizabeth? Is that what we're talking about? Superheroes and stuff?
Very close. Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Cinematic universe. That's the right C word. Okay, thank you. And also reality TV.
Nerd terminology, correct?
Yeah, I can't get on board with the Marvel stuff. I think it's great, but I don't know anything about it. Reality TV, which I know you're also a fan of, that we can chat about after. I'm excited. But I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth. We're really grateful to have you here. Thanks so much.
And just really quickly, for anyone who has questions that might come up for you during the talk, if you place them in the chat, Ty and I will be monitoring the chat, and we will ask those questions at the end after Dr. Dutro's talk is finished.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen real quick and then dive in. All right, hopefully you all can see that.
Yep, we're good.
Excellent. Well, everyone, it is such a privilege and true delight to be with you all today. And I'm just very grateful to the organizers of this speaker series for inviting me. So thank you, Cassie, thank you, Ty, and Rob and other organizers, and thank you all for being here today. I titled my talk, The Vulnerable Heart of the Writing Classroom, Centering Trauma in Critical Responsive Pedagogy. And here's how I'll start. By holding close that all of the stark realities of this well past a year and a half now, and long histories of injustice, mean that there is loss in this room. There's anger, there's despair, there's exhaustion. And I know there is also joy, commitment, perseverance, and fierceness. And all of that is fuel for the beautiful and committed ways you all come together for kids. So with all of that, today I want to think with you about seeking and attuning to the complexities of life in students' presence, their knowledge, their perspectives, lives, and literacies. I want to think about how life, literacy, and learning come together in brilliant and poetic ways in the midst of what is undoubtedly traumatic. I want to think about how witnessing one another as a reciprocal process and stance in writing classrooms is humanizing pedagogy, is a radical relational practice, and can be an anti-racist practice, and is a source of critical hope, which is a word I have to try to hold on to. So when I need reminding of the light to walk toward in students' literacies, I often return to a quote by the Chicana feminist anthropologist Ruth. And she writes, "There's poetry to be found in all human endeavors to understand the world. The thing is to know how to see the poetry, how to hear the poetry, how to feel the poetry. More often, the thing is just to remember that it's there." Because we spend our days with young people, we are surrounded by sources of beauty, of searing commentary on injustice, and so much hope. This quote also helps me situate myself in my field, and yours too, of literacy, and also as a scholar and teacher whose work is grounded in the humanities. I think a lot about the stories that human beings are living and are always telling in various ways about ourselves and about others, and how the stories we tell and that others circulate about us matter to how we're seen and who we get to be in various contexts. And the stories of hard things are always entering schools and classrooms. It was the case for me as a kid with the sudden death of my younger brother, my closest person, whose picture you see here, when I was an adolescent. And it is always the case, let alone now during the impacts of COVID. What we've learned in my research with teacher colleagues is that those difficult experiences, including trauma, hold potential for positive connection to one another, support for children and youth, and fuel for learning. I'll share some examples of that as we go along. I want to focus as much time as possible on students today, but I also want to be sure to honor with gratitude the many colleagues and authors whose research and writing infuses these ideas, just some of whom are represented here. So here are some ideas I'll discuss today. Why the term trauma is complex in context of education. And here I'll emphasize the importance of keeping that term complex. And then we'll turn to examples of how students invite us to attune to the reciprocity, vulnerability, and poetics of testimony and witness to trauma. And then we'll look at multiple dimensions of trauma that ELA educators can consider in striving to be the most supportive and responsive to students. And then how the complexities of trauma can fuel positive connections and justice-centered literacy pedagogy in classrooms. I want to be clear on why I find it so important to recognize the complexity of the word trauma and how it is used in relation to students in schools. That word is always heavy, with the certainty of hard things: hurt, loss, pain, despair, violence, oppression, to name but a few of the experiences it might suggest. And it is also a word that gets used to describe such a wide range of experiences that specificity is important if we're to respond in necessary and appropriate ways. To say that trauma is a complex term may seem obvious, yet the risks of oversimplifying or emphasizing some impacts over others can be consequential for students. So as I'll discuss more, we have to hold that complexity in front of mind always when we see trauma used in relation to students in schools. Many children carry deeply difficult experiences into classrooms, like me, like you. So do teachers. Those experiences take many forms and have varying impacts, but whether or not they're acknowledged or allowed to breathe, they're there. Of course, we know this. We live it, see it, and hear it every day in classrooms. The everydayness of living and encountering the full range of life experiences in no way makes them less extraordinary, less arresting, less moving, and less confusing. So what we can always ask is, what counts as trauma? What forms of life's challenges get deemed trauma, and for whom? We'll start with the child's writing as our guide and mindset in staying in a space of curiosity and wonder at the day-to-day and moment-to-moment potential of testimony and witness in writing classrooms when hard things are invited to live and breathe in school. I'll return to these ideas of testimony and witness in a bit, Now, though, let's look at Naya's letter to her baby brother. This was a gem she had drafted originally in her writer's notebook. Dear baby brother, I'm really sad you died. I wish I can talk to you, and I wish you were still alive. It's like you never existed. I want to know if you can wear mittens. DeAndre, I really miss you. I hope that you really miss me. I want to ask you questions, but you won't reply. I'm feeling happy, but sad because you died. I know you would be in kindergarten. I love you so much. One time I had a dream that you were alive, and I was so happy. I really love you. Love, Naya. If you've lost someone dear to you, don't you recognize that tension Naya captures between it's like you never existed and that person's ever presence with you? How her pairing of I'm feeling happy and but sad because you died captures the sense that happiness is never the absence of sadness, a sensation that is just baked into the everyday of life after such a loss. We can linger on how she strings wishes like holiday lights throughout her letter. Naya's is one of countless examples, and that you, I know, experience so often in your classrooms, are words to crawl into, meditate on for a bit, and attempt to absorb for their profundity and their beauty. Naya wrote about her baby brother across genres in second grade. I share her planning sheet for a personal narrative here too, because it's an example of the testifying she is doing, as well as the poetics of that stage of her writing, well before she drafted and crafted her narrative. Her category here of what happened starts as a list. He was dead. All of us were so sad. We kept his ashes. The container was blue. Lots of people were there. On that pre-writing page, she also includes a category of who was there, listing names, including doctors and nurses, angels, and the devil. Then a separate list called very sad people with a long list of family members. But then it's as if in the midst of her pre-writing, she experiences this urgent need to start writing this as a narrative, and she finds enough empty space on the page to fit narrative in those cascading words from top to bottom, setting them off with a flowing border. They look and feel like poems. But this is also an example of how it takes puzzling through to notice, to witness. Both the craft and the details of her loss require lingering and absorbing. The lingering becomes that invitation to curiosity and wonder. It is true of poetry by professional poets like Jamal May here, and it is equally there in the ways children and youth pursue their literacies. In Naya's writing, we can see the craft of her letter, and we can see how her pre-writing invites us to read it as poetry, and how her writing provides insight into the grief Naya is feeling and thinking about at school. We'll return to students writing shortly, but with a child in mind, I want to turn to some of the layers of complexity when considering trauma in education. And that is, trauma is personal and shared. Trauma is part of the human condition and is systemically targeted, and trauma is carried into institutions and inflicted by institutions. So trauma is often so specific and so shared. The virus is certainly an example of this, among many we could point to. The pandemic is saturated with pain, loss, and fear on a global, national, province, and community level. All children and youth have been experiencing loss of the physical presence of significant people, of important milestone events and celebrations, as well as fear for loved ones and possibly themselves. And the challenges embedded in the experience of the pandemic are so highly specific and personal to individual children and youth and their families. I'll turn to impacts on specific communities in the next slide, but of course, some students are mourning loved ones and have felt the impact of compounded economic hardship, to voice just a sliver of the specific impacts. Turning to trauma as part of the human condition and systemically targeted, we can certainly agree that no human gets through life unscathed. Human bodies are finite and fragile, so loss and grief and physical and emotional pain happen in all lives in some form. Humans find ways to inflict trauma on one another in ways that impact many people across identities and communities. We can think of other examples of hard things that someone may experience by virtue of living as a human. However, many traumas illustrate how hardship, pain, and loss is not at all the same across communities and circumstances. This points to how trauma is targeted. Those targeted traumas arise from the systems of societies and institutions that create or exacerbate pain, loss, and struggle. We know that Black, Indigenous, people of color communities disproportionately continue to take the brunt of this pandemic for reasons embedded in centuries of oppression in both of our countries, and that is layered onto the fear, pain, and grief of relentless racial violence. Educators who do not share students' racial identities and the trauma of racism, white teachers like me, must join colleagues of color in committing to anti-racism so we can bring awareness, advocacy, and the keenest compassion to supporting students. Many approaches to trauma in relation to schools focus on trauma as issues that are carried into schools. All approaches certainly argue that schools may need to change in response to students' trauma. But there is less emphasis in the trauma-informed schools conversation on how schooling inflicts trauma on students. And this is also a targeted trauma because Black, Indigenous students of color are far more likely to experience institutional harms. But of course, we know this because we have decades of research studies in education that have investigated bias, racism, sexism, homophobia, and disability discrimination in curriculum instruction and educational policies. How does institutional trauma persist for so long in schooling? Systems and the language of schools that exacerbate inequity become invisible, as they can seem to be just the way it is. So, for example, we can think about how easily children and youth can become labeled, whether academically or behaviorally, through language that seeps into the way schools operate, a kind of shorthand that reduces a complex, knowledgeable person to a low kid, a high kid, a problem. So why unpack the complexity of trauma in these ways? Because some of the ways trauma is discussed in relation to students uses a very broad brush, and that's risky. I wanted to share a couple of images that convey some of the risks we have to guard against when creating programs meant to address trauma. The language around those deemed traumatized can quickly become focused on damage and brokenness and the need to fix students. This can be exacerbated when neuroscience is used to show how trauma impacts the brain and thus cognition. Images of brain scans literally locate damage inside of individual students. I'm not about questioning that science for sure. That is not my field. But many studies show the power of images in influencing human perspective. So images and the language around them can fuel those narratives of damage that can further marginalize students. This just argues for bringing a discerning eye and questioning stance to how trauma is approached in various programs and frameworks that schools might adopt. A brain scan or a graphic representation of levels and stages can perhaps play a role, but we have to realize that they impose their own logic on us, even when the capabilities and knowledge and insight we experience from children and youth defy that logic of that very representation. What we all want is for kids to feel central, included, seen, and heard. But of course, it's not a straightforward project to make the difficult aspects of life matter in ways that support the student. Students who have experienced trauma often face a conundrum. They may sense that a salient, traumatic, crucial event from life might not be welcome in school. At the same time, if the student would accept an invitation to bring their experience into school, they get no guarantees it will be met with respect, empathy, compassion, and critical advocacy. How can we ensure we are being discerning and approaching trauma in schools, particularly when programs are created or adopted by school systems? Here are just some of the questions that some teacher colleagues and I have come to that have helped us analyze those kinds of approaches. Who benefits from this? Whose perspectives are being heard and honored here? How is the world being divided in this language in ways that benefit some more than others? What is being made invisible? What is valuable and serves students well? What needs to be questioned and resisted in the way this is being sold to me? These are important questions for many issues in education, and certainly for something as crucial and complex as trauma. So we get to witness the complexity and poetics of life in our writing classrooms. All of this is what teacher colleagues and I were thinking about as we designed and studied pedagogies that allowed us to center the idea of classrooms as always full of testimony and the necessity of witness. We were particularly interested in how difficult experiences enter and circulate in schools and classrooms in ways that too often did fuel those deficit views of children and youth and false narratives of damage. So we wanted to design and hone tangible and actionable practices in school literacy instruction, as well as knowledge and stances. Over the course of some years designing and studying these approaches, we identified these central guiding principles. But what I'll highlight today that became central for our inquiry group was the idea that testimony and witness were wrapped up with one another. They needed to be viewed as circular in classrooms. Someone's testimony shared in the room or by a character in a book always sparks connection with other stories. Those connections spark more testimony, which requires witnessing, and on and on. Also crucial was reciprocity. Too often teachers are positioned solely as witnesses, and even more troublesome sometimes as healers, which consistently position students as the ones in need of, and teachers as outside of or apart from the need to testify or to have witnesses. That is, of course, a false distinction and can fuel harmful assumptions of both students and teachers. But when teachers allow children and youth to witness their humanity, their vulnerabilities, students are positioned as active participants in a reciprocal process of being present as witnesses for one another. And teacher sharing helps to demonstrate to students that all aspects of life belong in school, that they are seen, heard, and valued in the classroom, and that their experiences matter as a source of knowledge for school literacies. This kind of reciprocity in classrooms allows for teachers' creativity, voice, and the poetics of your life to be consistently present for students and as fuel for persisting in teaching life when things get rough. So that's the context for the writing examples I'm sharing across the next several slides. So teachers' experiences and the ways they share them matter in writing classrooms. I say it and wonder if that sounds self-evident and obvious, but there's so much in education that makes it not at all a given. Might Naya have found space and trust to write about her baby brother in second grade no matter what? Maybe. Will poetics of students writing be present no matter the pedagogies they encounter? Absolutely, some will always find a way. But Naya's teacher, Megan, intentionally made clear that stories that mattered to students mattered to school writing. All of the writing I'm sharing occurred as part of official instruction, where pedagogies of testimony and witness had happened, which means that Megan found ways like this one to share her own writing about significant, sometimes difficult experiences from her life. Megan shared this story in a lesson on personal narrative. She would have been modeling her writing in front of students no matter what the content. What shifts is not the learning goals of the lesson or the focus on particular aspects of literacy emphasized in these district curricular lessons, but on the kinds of connections to life experiences students were invited to make. The shift here is that the content was about losing her grandfather. As we'll see, it is the larger themes of loss and fear in this story that some of the young children took up as invitation to write about meaningful stories for their own lives. We found that small shifts in content can make a huge difference in how students will respond. After Megan's lesson, when children then wrote their own narratives, they took up topics ranging from lost pets to fears for family members serving in the military, to a grandfather's death, to a quarrel with friends, and many others. And some children wrote of the threats their families face from systems, such as immigration policies, like Laura's story here, as well as complex feelings about law enforcement. When Laura writes of her uncle's deportation and its ripple effects on her family, her story speaks back to the policies and rhetoric around immigration in the United States. She writes, "I need to tell you something. I heard my uncle say something to my dad. I thought that it was going to be something good, but it was not so good news. He said, 'I'm going to work the whole weekend in a far place.' Then on Monday afternoon, he went with his whole company to eat. They were waiting for the food. Then the police came. Woo, woo. The police got out of his car and said, 'Who has identification?' But my uncle didn't have one, so he and 4 people had to go to jail. But then the police left him in Mexico. Now my auntie is leaving to Mexico because my uncle is in Mexico. It is not the same thing without them because they always used to come visit us. And when it was Christmas, he would bring lots of presents and he would say to do some tamales, and we would." Along with important content, we see the writer's craft that students bring to their writing. Laura definitely does what poets and storytellers so wish to do, building immediate investment, a sense of urgency, of anticipation of what might be coming next. The details of her story follow her pull of her reader into intimacy. I need to tell you something. She starts with words reserved for trusted friends, sharing something she overheard in adult conversation, a sense that this was not meant for her ears. Laura recreates the chaos and alarm of a routine work lunch shattered. She weaves in dialogue throughout that conveys tone, as well as the intricacies and intimacies of her family relationships. Laura's story also illustrates how we so often see small elements of the teacher's modeled writing in students' responses, even as they personally shape the invitation to their own lives. This is very different than what we've found with more generic texts intended to model certain aspects of writing for children that may be included with curriculum, or when a teacher models writing that focuses on topics such as going to the park or taking a family trip, where students will often take up the specific topic of those stories. In the case of this writing lesson, it was striking how many versions of Megan's title traveled across topics in children's writing, from Laura's here to The Saddest Sad, Sad Day, which was about a pet turtle that had died, to flipping the title completely to The Happiest Day. In the invitations opened up time and again, we see how the lost pet still matters and may matter a lot, but the lost grandfather, the missed uncle are also literally on the page as possibility. Those possibilities allow writers' ideas and connections to proliferate, which allow knowledge of the very hardest stuff of life to be resources for school writing. In this next example, one child's experiences and the ways he was sharing it with his classmates were the motivation for a literature-based writing project that Megan designed that she built around this book, The Lemonade Club. This child had been through a lot, including being separated from his biological family, separation from all but one of his siblings, and incomprehensibly a cancer diagnosis just 2 weeks before his first day of 2nd grade in his new school. The book here chronicles a school year in which first a child and then the teacher are diagnosed with cancer, and their illness and treatment unfold in relationship with each other and their classroom community. So it was very resonant with what Megan's student was going through, but also their classroom community. After reading that book, and I should say with this child's permission and enthusiasm, and over the course of a few weeks, the children in Megan's classroom brainstormed and wrote about topics for a lemonade narrative, an experience the children chose as an example of life's sweeter moments, and a lemon narrative on an experience the child identified as difficult in whatever way they chose to define that. Here I show the list of lemon and lemonade topics written by that child I mentioned. This child's lemons list includes having cancer, having to leave his brothers when he moved to a foster home. And then his lemonade, and the one he chose to publish and share, focuses on his foster parents' care through his cancer, and that he can see his brothers more often thanks to his new location with his foster parents. His list reveals something we've consistently noticed. Trauma and sources of connection and sustenance, even joy, are bound up together in children's writing and talk. Children reveal the pain and joy in what is unquestionably painful. His painful events have a counterpart on his sweeter list. In other words, sidelining the challenging experiences can also exclude what the child feels is most sweet. In this example, we'll turn to poetry, and these are poems students wrote following a poetry lesson in which Megan shared a poem she composed in the form of a 10 things about someone or something. She wrote about her dog that she'd lost and was missing. What we can notice here is that pattern we found of children connecting their own writing to the deeper themes of that original text, and that some children do take up the specific topic. For instance, here we have a poem about a child's dog. We have one about the turtle that died, a grandfather who had passed away, and a child separated from his father due to incarceration. So while Megan definitely had doubts and worries that it might seem as though she was drawing equivalency between experiences, the loss of a dog versus some of the trauma children were experiencing, what we've learned is that it is about sharing experiences that deeply matter. And children respond with empathy in the moment, and then often choose to bring connection to those significant themes in their writing. It opens a space, as children's writing shows, but it means that those deeper themes have to be present and intentionally shared in the texts we all choose and use in classrooms. Turning to another genre, letter writing proved to be a powerful context for children to bring their hard experiences to their literacies. In fact, given what we learned, even if the official curriculum doesn't include letter writing, which many of them do not, I encourage it as a literacy activity, even a one-day event. As her modeled writing for the unit on letters, Megan wrote a lovely letter to the grandfather who had passed away. It could seem to be a simple decision, but it was designed with intention and was incredibly powerful for some children. You could feel the children's attention ignite when Megan said she was writing to someone who could not receive her letter. Many children then chose to write a letter to someone who was absent from their lives, and those letters were often showcases for children's effective use of many elements that make for powerful writing, including metaphor and imagery and voice. Naya's letter to her baby brother from earlier was written in such a unit one year. So here I asked Dworkin how he chose whom to write to. And he said, well, I wanted to write to my dad because I never get to see him because he died and I never get to see him. He told me his dad was killed by gun violence 2 years before when Bron was 5 years old. He then read his letter aloud. His image of two roads converging to bring two people together connects to narratives, both written and filmed, that I know we've all seen, of loss and separation finally resolving as the two figures become discernible to one another in the distance, walking turns to running, and finally they are wrapped in joyful embrace. At the same time, the letter itself represents a tangible link to his father. I asked him, so how did it feel to write your letter to your dad? It was good, he said. You know, I can't talk to my dad. And so I wrote a letter, and I'm like seeing if one day, if I go to heaven, I'll be holding the paper and I'll see him and I'll be able to say, Dad, I wrote this letter to you. But I think he already knows that I wrote to him. A bronze letter to his father here, and so many examples I could share, are expressions of trauma and are powerful uses of literacy that children opt to pursue in school. So I'll confess that for me, a lover of narrative and poetry, seeing and seeking this idea of trauma as powerful pedagogy in writing classrooms came more easily when certain genres were the focus. It was harder for me to imagine what this would mean for some informational genres, particularly research reports. But when we tried some ways of sharing personal stories that showed our connections to the informational topics and texts, students amazed us with their responses. The one on the left is me in a lesson on mammals with a curriculum that required that topic. I was sharing a connection between the book and the loss of my little brother. On the right is Marie, a third grade colleague. She started the research unit with a lesson on topic choice. She brainstormed a few topics that interested her. Then she wrote trains on her list. She paused. And when she spoke, her voice was wistful. It's strange, she told the students, that even writing the word train brings so many memories. When I was a kid, we lived near train tracks, and every night, right around my bedtime, I'd hear the train rattling down the tracks. But most important to me are my memories of my grandpa, who knew a lot about trains. Every time he came to visit, he and I would walk down to the train tracks, and he would tell me facts and stories about trains. She continued her story and then drew a circle around trains. I'm choosing trains. Even just thinking about trains, she said, makes me think of my grandpa and how special he was to me. This lit some children up in that classroom. And when Jade chose babies in their first year for her research, Maria and I experienced a joint, of course she did, moment. We knew that Jade's adored teenage sister was 4 months pregnant. Jade was taking her role as future auntie very seriously. For the month of that writing unit, every book she plucked from the library shelf, every login at the computer lab was a quest of anticipation, of joy, of commitment. They could do this, keep this baby safe and strong, 2 girls and their mother. The opportunities for testimony and witness then are present for teacher and for students in the stories that surround the topics. In a final example from a child, as part of our analysis, we trace echoes of trauma across children's school writing over the course of the school year. And we've learned the importance of taking a long view and how children are responding in sometimes very subtle ways over time. Enrique's writing is one example. We knew Enrique's just beloved older cousin had passed away the previous year. Early in the school year, Enrique's cousin appeared first on a list of possible topics he might write about for a personal narrative. This was from a lemon list as part of that writing unit that I described earlier. And he writes, my cousin Miguel died, I broke my arm, uncle and grandmother died, I tripped and hit the side of my chin, and baby chickens died. His cousin also appears in free writing portions of his writing journal, like one about family and playing video games that includes the cousin as a character. And at one point, Enrique chose a topic from his list related to death and loss, but it was the deaths of the baby chickens. Then, when they were learning about and writing poetry later in the year, that's when he wrote his poem that was about his cousin Miguel. So it wasn't until late in the year that he chose to write explicitly about his cousin's death, but you can see the echoes of that loss all through his earlier work across the year. And I want to turn to one of those echoes, that personal narrative from early in the year, to linger again on the form writing takes at various points and what those forms invite. When Enrique's narrative about the baby chickens was edited, when he'd gone through all the steps of the writing process and was ready to share, that's the excerpt on the right. And it allows us to see the details of his craft, those parts of his sentences that really do draw me up short and demand I reread them and mull them over. Especially for me, that moment in recording all of the things that took those chicks from him, some died of loneliness. But that's not the form he first wrote, of course. That page from his writer's notebook invites a very different kind of reading and response, which is a wilder one, a freer one. There's no punctuation, so the meaning shifts a bit with every reading. There are details in that first draft that aren't in the final version, like I dried them under the trampoline. And you can see in his draft how he was bringing those important themes of life and death, presence and absence, into his literacies in the ways that also matter to the writing goals his teacher was pursuing with students. Like most young children's writing, it cannot be skimmed if we're truly attuned to both the content and the craft. Skimming only invites the conventions portion of that rubric to take center stage when we know it belongs in the wings, waiting to be called in after other aspects of the writing have their time in the spotlight. Enrique's take-up of an invitation to testify to the trauma of losing his cousin, his grappling with loss, is not obvious. The opportunity he was taking up from the start of the year through to the end requires that the invitation be offered and be continually reinforced. So our study of children's responses to instruction that was designed to be responsive to and inclusive of students' challenging experiences emphasize approaches that do position students as witnesses to others' life experiences, including their teachers. Invite never require students to draw on the fullness of their lives as valued resource and source of knowledge for school. It's crucial to note that students are never required to write about a particular topic. They always, every time, have choice in what they take up and how they interpret an invitation and the ways they choose to share or not share. And these allow teachers to identify larger themes for connection and invitation, and in turn allow children to see their life experiences, including trauma, as central to what matters in school. These lessons I've shared are not happening every day. They're happening periodically, regularly enough to keep a consistent sense that that full range of life is valued as important and is honored in school. I'll emphasize too that when vibrant connections happen in classrooms, as you know, are joyful places. So these windows into this classroom absolutely exist into that kind of vibrant space. Of course, no approaches in and of themselves assure students trust or noticeable shifts in response to interactions or activities in the classroom. These approaches are a process, not an event. And these pedagogies and approaches to instruction are nested in classrooms where teachers are committed to striving to put their critical goals toward justice into action. To zoom in on the critical and what we've called critical witnessing, these practices are intentional, and of course they're visceral. These can be humanizing pedagogies because they showcase students' knowledge and the power of possibility in what students bring to literacies. And they can support us to interrupt harmful assumptions and labels that are part of the oppressive practices that have long inflicted harm on many children. Racism and other injustices are of course so ingrained in the language and histories of education that it takes vigilance to recognize and shift them, especially as a white teacher like me who benefits from those systems. For me, living my commitments requires learning about the histories of racial violence and oppression in my own country's history, listening to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer colleagues, family members, and authors, recognizing my complicity without defensiveness, and striving actively, fiercely, joyfully, and imperfectly to be what Dr. Bettina Love calls a co-conspirator for justice. With these commitments, centering trauma as critical responsive writing pedagogy in classrooms holds the potential to be central to anti-oppressive practices that position students in positive, powerful ways, honor their knowledge and brilliance, and recognize the fullness of their humanity. But of course, it's not simple. It takes intention and commitment and persevering when we inevitably stumble. I turn here just very briefly to how teachers have spoken to designing and trying to live their commitments in their responsive pedagogies. They often use identity-focused language to talk about their take-up of these kinds of pedagogies, as Kristen does here. Teachers speak about embracing vulnerability. Colleagues also describe the importance of taking care of themselves as they deeply invest in children's lives. And teachers also shared how approaching difficult experiences with intention propelled their commitments to strive toward justice in educational institutions, policies, and practices, as Victoria shares here, in trying to support this child at her school. What's consistent is this sense, this collective sense we've all had in our growing group of no turning back, and that presence of joy and fulfillment in teaching and learning that invites life to matter to school literacies in tangible ways. We all want to do it. We want to honor the complexity and richness of students' stories and what they know, But there are many reasons why it is not simple. Here are some of those factors as captured in research on the impacts of policy, and are some of the consistent issues that our research team members speak to and that teachers have shared over time. It takes explicit commitment, support, and collaboration from colleagues and mentors near and far. It takes forms of resistance that feel possible in any given context, and that will vary. It's not something to be sugar-coated, but bringing our visions to life is a practice and a process that can happen, that can be sustained. These few examples I've shared are from elementary age students, but the principles cross all grade levels and subject areas. Teaching and learning are emotional and relational across the board. We have to challenge the idea that only certain content areas, like our shared content area here today, demand those investments. What colleagues and I and many other researchers have found in secondary classrooms and for college students is that no matter the content, students feel valued and supported when teachers demonstrate trust, invest in relationships, position students as knowledgeable, provide flexibility, place the human above policy, and advocate for them. Across these contexts, this has to be genuine, of course. We have to try to trust students enough to be vulnerable with them, as well as listen to students with love and hold ourselves accountable to learn from students' experiences. We view them as knowledgeable and as desiring to invest in their learning. So why end with hummingbird? Because they both hover and they zip. In thinking about testimony and witness to the complexities of trauma in writing classrooms, it helps me to think about the pause required, the lingering necessary, as both literal and metaphorical. It's literal in that pausing to listen closely, to invest in relationship, to sit with students' writing, allows us to see what it is impossible to fathom otherwise. Each encounter with a student, on or off the page, gets to shimmer with curiosity, significance, and promise. There's the promise embodied by each student. Even if we can't linger with every student or every page every day, we know that promise is there. We know that foreclosing the knowledge gleaned from trauma, the shared and specific, the trauma carried into school and inflicted by school, is costly. In that way, the pause becomes metaphorical as this place of knowing, brilliance, and depth is present in each student, even as we have to zip through classes, teaching days, or responding to student work at a pace that allows us to function in our jobs. When we linger over a draft, when we decipher it and turn it all the various ways we can to see how it catches the light, it shows the promise of that writer. No matter how, on the surface, a writer can seem to be struggling with aspects of school writing. The writing is telling us a story, testifying to something about the life of that writer. It may be insights into life experiences. It may be insights into a particular talent for a well-chosen word, a vivid image, vibrant voice on the page. It may be insights into a unique perspective or a passion for a topic, insights into activism, insights into life in school related to how they're seen in school, insights from a packed page, insights from an empty page. Silence demands its own witnessing. So we can channel the hover amidst the zip and spread out that lingering across students over time to make it harder to feel so assured in our knowing and to find hope in seeing what we can't afford to miss. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. This was really lovely. And I just get so taken by not just the stories you share, but the beautiful language that you use to do so. So we want to open it up to questions. I know we have just a bit of time, and we have two sort of interrelated questions that came across to us in the chat. The first of these wanted to kind of ask first, what is the feel of the general sort of classroom when these sorts of things are happening in the lessons that you shared? And in particular, so in addition to that atmosphere, how is it that you might control or prevent intense feelings that could possibly create deeper pain for students who are sharing such sad stories? And then the second question sort of builds on that in terms of is it possible that children could be triggered or re-traumatized, even if they're not required to write about difficult topics? But what happens if their writing sort of gets away from them, or their feeling sort of gets away from them in the classrooms?
Oh, those are such good questions. I mean, first, dear colleagues, I'll say important questions about this life in classrooms. Of course, there's no like simple answers. I'm not going to pretend like there is and really hold complexity together around these things. What I'll say is, yes, I mean, these are classrooms that attention to community building starts from day one. So that it really is like there's time to come together and really just like sit together and talk about what's going on and share fun things as well as things that are on students' minds in community meetings or at the start of class. And this is across grade levels. And the teacher being the one to lead makes a huge difference. And to just share a vulnerable story, make it very clear that it is not required to share, but that there's openness to writing about topics that connect to life. So there's invitation without requirement. And yes, sometimes the students get their emotions surface. Absolutely. And you want that to land in a community of support and a sense of relationship with individual children, so that the teachers in our community can say to children like, oh, let's definitely talk. Let's meet right after we have our lessons so we can talk and have a hug. And these are also relationships that are built with families, so that families are kind of incorporate, they know what's happening in the classroom. Families are invited to be there. I remember one little girl was sharing a lemon story that she wrote in Megan's classroom, and it was about her cousin who was at that point deployed overseas, and she had chosen to share her story, and family members were there that day as the audience. And she started her story and then she stopped sharing her story and just walked over to her grandpa and just went right into an embrace in his arms. Yet that story was one of the most important stories to her that she wrote that year in second grade. So I think relationship is central to children, to youth, and also to families, and just that sense of connection in the community. But what I'm really like longing to hear is what you all think of that and what you've experienced as children share stories of their lives in your classroom. But I think we can go on to the next question, but it's, yeah.
Yes. So I was going to say, I think we have just a minute or two more. I don't know. I think that sort of covers what we had in the chat, as they were quite interrelated. But if there are other folks, if anyone has a quick question that they'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Otherwise, I know we have a lot of gratitude, it looks like, in the chat, with folks being impressed both by teaching and research. So we have one more question. Elizabeth, you should be able to unmute. Oh, so sorry. Did that work, Elizabeth? Sorry. I'm going to ask you to unmute one more time and see if it works. Or I can, there we go. Great.
Sorry. Thank you so much for this. This is my second question. I apologize. I'm just wondering, so I'm a teacher candidate and I'm deeply interested in critical witnessing pedagogy. And I'm also very aware of these professional guidelines that, we're supposed to follow as teachers, boundaries, et cetera. And it feels like a real rift. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts. I know that those things vary from district to district and, country to country. But, we're going to have a meeting tomorrow with the Teachers Federation, where we're going to be told unequivocally that we should not even, pat a child. We shouldn't have physical contact with them. And so I find, those things very intimidating in light of sort of enacting this witnessing.
Elizabeth, that's happening in some schools in the US too. It's so harmful that it's just hard to hear. I mean, right? I mean, we hear it and then you have to live it. And it is just, we just know how harmful that is. Like, to separate humanity and human connection from learning in the ways that some schools and some school policies are doing is, I mean, it is inhumane to students. What I wish for you is your own protection in your job. You have to do your work. And at the same time, that you and colleagues can find ways to resist and to just bring pedagogies of love and response to students in all the ways that, I mean, no, of course you will, and of course you can. And sometimes I truly believe those kinds of policies, they have to be defied in even the subtle ways we can, because they're doing so much harm for students. So I just want to be in your corner on this. The thought of certain kinds of boundaries when it comes to children and youth and our commitments to them and what we know learning entails around life and the knowledge of life and the way love needs to be at the center of learning is hard. So I'm just hearing how hard that is. I'm here for you.
I know we have a couple other kind of comments and sharing in the chat that I want to make sure you're able to read, Dr. Dutro, but we are at our time, and we do have a session for a handful of Toronto Writing Project folks who I'm sure have plenty of questions as well. So I want to thank you for this wonderful public lecture. I want to thank the folks who raised wonderful questions or shared stories of their own in the chat as well. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us today. For folks who are joining us for the sort of VIP session that is happening next, they're all, just for everyone's kind of knowledge, they all received a copy of the book and were able to read that together. And we will be meeting with Dr. Dutro in a smaller group to have a kind of close one-on-one to ask and answer questions. But you can be a part of this for our next session. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen really quickly. Our next session is, oh, there's my whole, there we go, screen with Antero Garcia. It'll be on January 20th at 6 p.m. again, where he'll be talking about his book, Pose, Wobble, and Flow. And so if you're interested, we will pop a PDF of that into the chat as well for folks who would like to join us. And if you also sign up on the link that Ty provided, you can join our mailing list and you'll have the opportunity to join the book club for that session as well. So thank you everyone who joined us tonight. For the TWP VIP folks, you have your Zoom link and we'll meet there at about 10 after 7 so everyone can kind of take a quick bio break. So thank you all for joining us and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you all so much.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.